Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 176, Every Man in His Humour. Learn to be wise and practice how to thrive. Last time, The Case is Altered introduced us to Ben Jonson's plays, with his version of a Roman comedy. His next offering pays its own debt to Roman comedy, but also shows us, in an almost fully formed way, Jonson's very own style. This is not the biting satire of many of his plays, and the assumed satire that got him into trouble at about the same time with The Isle of Dogs, but something a little gentler, in that he's not taking aim at specific people, and certainly not at the court, as he would do later. Every Man in His Humour is a city comedy, with its large cast of London characters, and it is they, as a group, who are Jonson's target on this occasion. The first performance of Every Man in His Humour was given by the Lord Chamberlain's men in 1598, this in September of that year, when it is thought that they were playing at the Curtain Theatre in Shoreditch. The company had been more or less evicted from the theatre thanks to a dispute with the landlord, so this is the period where the idea of taking the theatre down and transporting it to a new location, a home that would become the Globe, may have been forming in the minds of the Burbages. If you missed out on that story, which is one of the best concerning daring-do in the theatre of the period, have a dive back to episode 89, all about the London playhouses, for a full accounting. That 1598 date was confirmed by Jonson when the play was reprinted in his first folio in 1616, and is also supported by a textual allusion to a Burgundian fencer who had challenged all comers in London earlier that year, but by July was on trial for murder and in fact was later hanged. In an anecdote recorded by Nicholas Rowe, it is said that it was Shakespeare himself who argued for the play as the company were about to reject it. Although Rowe doesn't quote a source for this, and we should probably take it as apocryphal, Shakespeare is listed as one of the principal players in the folio edition of the play, so perhaps he did give the young Ben Jonson a helping hand in some way. Tradition holds that Shakespeare would have played Old Noel, fitting in with the more general tradition that Shakespeare typically took the part of the older characters. More recently, friend of the podcast Darren Feebry-Jones has suggested that it is far more likely that Shakespeare played Thomas Kitely, the merchant, this based on comparison of speech phrasing in that role, which then occurs in similar ways in later Shakespeare plays. As you know by now, we don't have too many records of the day-to-day performances given in Elizabethan theatres, but we do know that the King's Men performed this play at court in 1605 and then again in 1631, which in itself suggests that the play must have been popular for many years, and was probably performed multiple times by the company between those dates. We also have a record of the play being chosen by the Master of the Revels for one of the several benefit performances that were gifted to him in 1628. Again, by implication, we can say that the play therefore must have been very popular, given that the Master of the Revels knew his plays and no doubt only chose those that were guaranteed to bring in a decent revenue, which he was the beneficiary of. The play was first registered with the Stationers' Company for publication in August 1600, but it was marked as to be stayed, along with Shakespeare's Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing and As You Like It. It isn't clear why the licence to print wasn't immediately granted for these plays, but most likely it was some objection over the ownership. The Shakespeare plays were all printed soon after. Jonson's play was re-registered 10 days later and printed in a quarto edition in 1601, where the setting of the play is indicated as Florence. The next printing in the 1616 first folio puts the location as London. That relatively quick printing after the initial performances again suggests that this was a very popular play. The preservation of the quarto edition allows us to see the changes Jonson made for the folio publication some 15 years later. As we know, for the preparation of the folio, Jonson was scrupulous in his editing, concerned about such details of publication as punctuation, act and scene divisions and the like, in a way that other playwrights had not been, and this is not just confined to the folio. Unusually, the first quarto edition of Every Man in His Humour included a Latin motto on the title page, suggesting that from his earliest days Jonson saw his plays as something valuable in a literary sense. Although that location change from Florence to London is interesting, Jonson's revisions were far more thorough than a mere juggling with place names and topical allusions. But in fact, what is most notable is that he didn't make that second version even more topical for its date of revision. Evidently, he was more concerned with preserving the identity of the play as an example of his early work than making it a relevant read for the current audience. Consequently, dating the revision has proved an interesting exercise for scholars. Jonson's earliest authoritative editors, Hereford and Simpson, confidently placed the second version at about 1612, while later scholars have much more tentatively suggested many dates between 1604 and 1614, with the implication that the folio version is in fact the result of several revisions made over the years. So, when placing the play, we have to bear in mind that the later version bears the mark of the experienced playwright. But we can do this without disparaging the quarto version, from which much is preserved and is commendable. But just to be clear, it is the folio version that I refer to from here on in. The change in setting is perhaps not as significant as it might sound. Although Volpone, written in 1606, is set in Venice, all of the other Jonson comedies after 1610 were set in London, which is one of the many features that distinguishes Jonson from Shakespeare, who only had one comedy, the strangely exceptional The Merry Wives of Windsor, set in England, with all the others being set in specific, if somewhat inaccurate, versions of abroad. The punch of Jonson's humour and satire was closely aimed at the court, the gentry, and the people of London. His characters are Londoners, his themes concerned with a London life. And later in his career, and when he revised the setting of this play, he had the confidence not to hide behind a foreign setting. Although Every Man in His Humour clearly owes some large debts to Plautus and Terence, which, given his use of them in The Cases Altered, we know he knew well, there is no known specific source for the play. That feeling of this being a Jonson original is only increased with the later revisions putting the play into the London of the City comedies, plays that were currently being written by Marston, Middleton and others, where the city itself becomes a character in the day-to-day affairs of the tradesmen and other urban dwellers. As with other city comedies, the plot is little more than a vehicle for the critical display of modern moods and manners. But the play is not embedded in London in quite the way that a Middleton or a Dekker play was, and that is because the characters are not concerned with their surroundings specifically, and although the characters appear to interact, they are often mostly concerned with their own affairs, and some of the comedy is derived from the way that their questions and answers and their conversations match accidentally or mismatch, as the case may be. Here is a synopsis of the play, which I've made quite detailed, as the chances are that you're not familiar with this one. At his home, old Noel asks his servant, Brainworm, to call his son Edward. Old Noel is happy enough that Edward is enjoying his studies in London, but worries that he is too preoccupied with idle poetry. Noel's nephew, Master Stephen, calls in to see if Edward has any books on hawking and hunting. Noel sets about him, for this being another example of how wasteful Edward really is. A letter addressed to Edward arrives, but old Noel decides to read it. It is an invitation from Wellbred, a well-known gallant, asking Edward to come to London for a bit of fun. Old Noel is concerned about the company that his son is keeping, and considers intervening. Brainworm delivers the letter to Edward, and tells Edward that his father has seen it. Edward is delighted by the letter and plans to meet Wellbred later with Stephen in tow. Elsewhere in the city, the silly townsman, Master Matthew, calls on Captain Boggadill, a braggart soldier. Boggadill is lodging in the house of Cobb, a low-class water carrier, and his wife Tip. A poet, but also a well-known plagiarist, Matthew quotes from Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, and complains that Downright, Wellbred's half-brother, recently insulted his fashion sense. Bobbadil shows him some sword-fighting moves in an effort to prepare Matthew for any future altercations. Kitely, a London cloth merchant, is at home with Downright, who is a rather dour country gent, complaining about the behaviour of Wellbred, who has been lodging with him. Kitely reports that Wellbred has been keeping bad company and filling his house with lascivious jests. Kitely begins to worry that he has been made a cuckold of thanks to the gulls and gallants who seem to frequent his house, and he entrusts the servant Cash with the care of his wife and sister while he is out. Matthew and Bobadil duly arrive, looking for Wellbred. Downright gets increasingly angry about Wellbred's reported behaviour and finds Matthew and Bobadil very irritating. Cash has sent Cobb to find Kitely, who locates him at the house of the quirky but fair-minded Justice Clement, and he takes the opportunity to obtain a warrant for the arrest of Bobadil, with whom he has quarrelled over the virtues of tobacco. Meanwhile, Matthew has been making poetical advances to Bridget, which young Kendall and Wellbred mockingly encourage to the disgust of Downright, and the distraction of the returned Kitely, who assumes that it is the young Edward Noel who has made him a cuckold. In front of his wife and his sister, he disguises his distress as a fever. At Moorfields, Brainworm is disguised as a vagrant soldier, with a plan to follow old Noel while he spies on Edward and to report back to Edward later. When Edward and Stephen arrive, Brainworm stays in character and fools Stephen into buying a poor-quality sword. Then old Noel comes by, wondering whether he ought to be intervening in Edward's life or not. Brainworm appears, still disguised as a soldier, and begs for money from old Noel. The old man is completely fooled by his disguise and agrees to take Brainworm on as a servant, not realising that the man he is taking on already is his servant. Edward has fallen in love with Bridget, Kitely's sister, and while he and Wellbred depart to arrange a secret marriage, Brainworm diverts attention by making Cobb's house the focus of Kitely's suspicions. The resulting recriminations leave the party to seek the mediation of Justice Clement, at whose house Bobadil and Matthew are seeking a warrant against Downright, who has soundly beaten both of them. Despite the compounded deceptions which Brainworm now confesses, Clement commends him for his wit and cheerfully dispenses his own brand of justice, saying that Brainworm deserves to be pardoned for the wit of the offence. Clement congratulates the newlyweds and mocks Matthew for his poetic pretensions. He orders that there be a merry feast to celebrate the marriage and implores everybody to put off all this discontent. In high spirits, Clement talks about how the adventures of the day will be remembered and applauded for a long time into the future. The newly married Edward and Bridget are reconciled with their various relations, as is Kitely with his wife, and the party adjourns for a celebratory supper. It has been said that the first thing to admire in this play is both its conception and its complexity. By the end of the first act, there are 4 major plot lines underway. We have the deception of old Noel by his son, the gulling of Stephen, the trials of Cobb, and the gulling of Matthew and Bobadil. Then Act 2 follows with the additional complications of the business around Kitely and his jealousies. This is assured stuff, and gives a real sense that Jonson, even at this early stage, was a great planner with a sense of how a play has to build to its climax. As other characters are presented, it is always so that they add to intrigues already begun, just as characters that are already active in one intrigue become an additional part in another. Justice Clement's humorous tribute to Brainworm, the chief manipulator in most of these intrigues, shows the debt Jonson is paying to the Roman model in this respect. But no clever slave ever had so many balls in the air. In this play, there is an excess of gulls for Brainworm to have his fun with. The clue to the characters in the play is in the title. I introduced or reminded you about the humours theory last time, and here we see how character is seen as the effect of a humoral imbalance. Each has a singular disposition or a particular quality that influences their actions, but there is also a somewhat broader meaning here too. That disposition can be an affected one, making the character more layered, but also still more representative of a type than an individual if the affectations are missed. For some of the contemporary audience, this was not a bad thing. Elizabethans and Jacobeans had little expectation of seeing individual characters represented on stage and were comfortable with the idea of a character being of and representing a type. In that sense, Shakespeare is the outlier here, with his ability to craft characters who were both individuals and able to speak to all men. With his focus on comedy, it's not surprising that Jonson uses characters who are at the eccentric end of the scale. It is a comedy technique that started in ancient Greece and continues to this day. And, as a consequence, in many cases his characters are more obviously funny to us than are Shakespeare's. The main characters in the play can be easily traced back to Greek comedy via Plautus and Terence. We have the suspicious father in Old Noel, the errant son in Edward, the wily servant in Brainworm, the braggart soldier in Bobadil, the would-be poet in Matthew, and the gull in Stephen. The only characters missing from the classic Roman comedy are a rival suitor and a pair of ladies of ill repute. But Jonson is doing much more than just copying these stock characters. Perhaps most significantly, Brainworm, the cunning slave character, is not out for material gain, but, it would seem, just for the joy of the pure mischief of it all. In the classic tale, Old Noel would be outwitted by Edward and Brainworm, but that isn't quite the way it happens here, and Jonson is more interested in the crisscrossing of the paths of the various characters, each on the extreme end of being believable. He wants to show us their fallibilities and their foibles. Also missing from the classic setup is the severe punishment of the errant characters at the end of the play. In the Italian version, there was harsh and humiliating punishment for Matthew and Bobadil, but with the later revisions, Jonson reduced that to a purely symbolic exclusion from the wedding banquet. Bobadil, who we might see as a kind of Falstaff character, always manages to explain his own quite different view of events in justification for his actions, which gives him a sort of comic dignity. And it is much easier to see how he will continue in the same vein throughout his life, in a way that perhaps we can't for Falstaff. The overreaching joke here, and it is true of all Johnsonian comedy, is that each character believes himself to be central to the action, whereas in fact Jonson carefully ensures that he creates a strong group of characters so that in fact any individual could more or less be removed from the play without too much of a loss. The play begins, not unusually, with a prologue, but it is not given as a character, and its purpose is to set out the playwright's aims, which are broadly applicable to most of Jonson's plays. Firstly, he says that he is seeking to give an accurate depiction of the deeds and language of Elizabethan London. Secondly, he wants to fill the play with characters that show an image of the times. If the play can achieve this picture of what he calls popular errors, then, he suggests, the audience will laugh at them and agree there is hope left, that they may like men. He gives an overview of the state of theatre, name-checking Shakespeare in the process, and also acknowledges the debt to ancient Greek theatre with a mention of the role of the chorus, although there is no such role in this play. His approach, according to the prologue, will be to employ deeds and language such as men do use, and persons such as comedy would choose, when she would show an image of the times, and spot with human follies, not with crimes. This prologue ridicules the way other playwrights offend against Jonson's own sense of correctness. He is very scornful of history plays with their broad sweep through time and place, riding roughshod over the classical unities. We don't really have those problems, especially when approaching Shakespeare's history plays, but Jonson's point is that, to his mind, there was value to be gained by confining the action of a play to a single day, and in the setting of a single city. There were points where Jonson undoubtedly stretches credulity in the unity of action, but, I think, it is the very constraints of these unities that enabled Jonson to create a play that remains coherent despite the anarchic situations being presented on stage. The characters may seem to somehow muddle through to the end, but Jonson's hand is always firmly on the tiller. Here is the prologue in full. The need make many poets, and some such as art and nature, have not bettered much. Yet ours, for want, have not so loved the stage, as he dare serve the ill customs of the age, or purchase your delight at such a rate, as for it he himself must justly hate. To make a child now swaddled, to proceed man and then shoot up in one beard, and weed past 60 years, or with 3 rusty swords, and help of some few 1.5 foot words, fight over York and Lancaster's long wars. And in the tiring house bring wounds to scars. He rather prays you will be pleased to see one such today, as other plays should be, where neither chorus wafts you o'er the seas, nor creaking throne comes down, the boys to please. Nor nimble squib is seen to make afeard the gentlewomen, nor rolled bullet heard to say it thunders, nor tempestuous drum rumbles to tell you when the storm doth come. But deeds and language such as men do use, and persons such as comedy would choose, when she would show an image of the times, and sport with human follies, not with crimes. Except we make 'em such by loving still our popular errors, when we know they're ill. I mean such errors as you'll all confess by laughing at them, they deserve no less. Which when you heartily do, there's hope left then, you that have so graced monsters may like men. Brainworm may be the servant of old Noel, but he has greater affinity with his master's son. He is a master of disguise, managing to fool both his master and Justice Clement into not recognising him, and then, even more audaciously, arresting downright. He is the instigator of most of the deceptions in the play, and he spurs the action along with his aiding of Edward. All this, of course, means he fits the role of the clever slave from Roman comedy very neatly, but in this case he is not condemned for his actions nor punished as we might expect. As Justice Clement says, "And I will consider thee in another cup of sack. Here's to thee, which having drunk of, this is my sentence. Pledge me, thou hast done or assisted to nothing in my judgment, but deserves to be pardoned for the wit of the offence. If thy master or any man here be angry with thee, I shall suspect his engine, while I know him for it." Edward Noel is a portrait of a young London student, perhaps someone quite close to how Jonson saw his younger self, deeply invested in his education, but, and this is much to his father's disapproval, also with a penchant for idle poetry. He is young and impressionable, but definitely a cut above his rather dim cousin Stephen. In cahoots with Brainworm, he takes pleasure in thwarting his father's plans and avoiding his surveillance. United at the close with Mistress Bridget, you get the feeling that Jonson really enjoyed creating this character, with his mix of intelligence and mischief. Edward's father, Older Noel, is set up as the disapproving father in the Roman model, but he struggles with the rights and wrongs of controlling and monitoring his son much more than a theatrical Roman father ever did. It is almost against his better judgment that he sets out to spy on Edward. Although he proves himself to be something of a fool when he does not recognise the disguised Brainworm, this and his final approval of the marriage of Edward and Bridget leaves us with the idea that he is actually a rather kindly father. His long speech on the nature of parenthood is touching, concerning and timeless. Here's just a part of it. I cannot lose the thought yet of this letter sent by my son, nor leave to admire the change of manners and the breeding of our youth within the kingdom, since myself was one. When I was young, we lived not in the stews, durst have conceived a scorn and uttered it on a grey head. Age was authority against a buffoon, and a man had then a certain reverence paid unto his years, that had none due unto his life. So much the sanctity of some prevailed, for others, but now, we all are fallen. Youth from their fear, and age from that which bred it, good example. Nay, would ourselves were not the first, even parents, that did destroy the hopes in our own children, or they not learned our vices in their cradles, and suckled on our ill custom with their milk, ere their teeth be born, or they can speak, the palate's coming. The first words we form their tongues with are licentious jests. Can it call whore, cry bastard? Oh, then kiss it, a witty child. Can swear? The father's darling. Give it to plums? Nay, rather that shall learn nobody's song, the mother herself will teach it. And it continues in a similar vein into the inherited and learnt behaviours of childhood and adolescence. Jonson also has a lot of fun with Matthew, the town gull, the foolish man about town who recites poetry that he claims to be his own, but which is in fact heavily plagiarised. In a foreshadowing of his later work, he is the poetester, the writer of inferior poetry. It is all humorous, but we can sense Jonson's severe gaze and disapproval of him. As Cobb, the water carrier, says of him, "He useth every day to a merchant's house, where I serve water, one Master Kitely's, in the old Jewry. And here's the jest, he is in love with my master's sister, Mrs. Bridget, and calls her mistress. And there he will sit you a whole afternoon, sometimes reading all those same abominable, vile, a pox on 'em, I cannot abide them, rascally verses, poetry, and speaking of interludes. 'Twill make a man burst to hear him, and the wenches, they do so jeer and tee-hee him." Matthew's admiration of Bobadil and his cowardice at the thought of a sword fight with him make Matthew the butt of the joke more often than not, and the final condemnation of his art and his character by Justice Clement, the comparatively harsh censure by a gentle justice of refusing him an invitation to the wedding, marks him out as the real bad apple in this group of misfits. Bobadil is a fairly typical braggart soldier, with his constant boasting about his exploits in battle and abilities with the sword, tall tales that are quickly undermined by downright's ability to disarm him with ease. Justice Clement is more than unimpressed when he asks Bobadil to explain himself, and all he gets is an account of rather pathetic events. "Faith, sir, so it is this gentleman and myself have been more uncivilly wronged and beaten by one downright, a coarse fellow about the town here, and for mine own part I protest, being a man in no sort given to this filthy humour of quarrelling, he hath assaulted me in the way of my peace, despoiled me of mine honour, disarmed me of mine weapons, and rudely laid me along in the open streets, where I not so much as once offended to resist him." Clement detects his facade that tries to disguise a lack of bravery and his inauthentic nature. "Oh, God's precious, is this a soldier? Here, take my armour off quickly, 'twill make him swoon, I fear. He is not fit to look on't that will put up a blow." And the last of the main characters is Kitely the cloth merchant and Wellbled's landlord. He becomes increasingly upset by his lodger's behaviour and the company that he keeps, which is just the spark for his increasing paranoia that builds during the course of the play, his greatest fear being that he has been cuckolded. Jonson aims to have every character dominated by one particular trait or characteristic, and with Kitely we see jealousy at its worst. Early on in the play, he identifies the issue, equating it to an infection. "A new disease? I know not new or old, but it may well be called poor mortal's plague, for like a pestilence it doth infect the houses of the brain. First it begins solely to work upon the fantasy, filling her seat with such pestiferous air, as soon corrupts the judgment, and from thence sends like contagion to the memory, still each to other giving the infection, which as a subtler vapour spreads itself confusedly through every sensitive part, till not a thought or motion in the mind be free from the black poison of suspect. Ah, but what misery it is to know this, or knowing it, to want the mind's erection in such extremes. Well, I will once more strive, in spite of this black cloud, myself to be, and shake the fever off that thus shakes me." But it takes the duration of the play for him to overcome his humours and realise the error of his ways. He is cured, a little unbelievingly, by Justice Clement, even as he struggles to overcome his state. A state that is represented by the fact that when appealing for forgiveness from his innocent wife, his attempt at poetry collapses into prose. Through the Restoration and well into the 18th century, every man in his humour was less popular than Volpone, the alchemist, and even the Silent Woman. but it was performed in 1725 and 1751, the latter of which was a version augmented by David Garrick. He played Kitely, and the part became one of his signature roles. This production prompted a more regular return of the play into the repertoire. In fact, it was a recurring regular at Drury Lane, where over the next 25 seasons only 2 did not feature the play. It was also performed at Covent Garden until it took a bit of a break at the turn of the century, until Edmund Kean revived it in 1816. Although this was not particularly well received, other professional productions followed with some regularity. In 1845, one Charles Dickens was much admired playing the role of Bobadil in an amateur benefit production, which was repeated several times over the next couple of years. It is surely not the fault of the great novelist, but after that the play fell out of favour, with very few productions through the rest of the century. In 1937 it was revived at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon to celebrate the tercentenary of Jonson's death, a production that featured Donald Wolfett as Bobadil. The play has continued to languish somewhat, although in what must have been a very intriguing revival, Joan Littlewood produced it in 1960 in Stratford, London, with her Theatre Workshop Company. The last major production was in 1986, where it was part of the inaugural season of the Swan Theatre at Stratford-upon-Avon, the new space that was built into the space left when the original Shakespeare Memorial Theatre was gutted by fire in 1926. When Samuel Pepys read part of Every Man in His Humour, as is recorded in his diary in February 1667, he noted that, "Wherein is the greatest propriety of speech that ever I read in my life." It is an interesting comment from a great man of letters, and one that Jonson would probably have appreciated. Propriety, in the sense that Pepys was using it, means appropriateness. In the view of Pepys, Jonson had got the balance right. As a play largely rendered in prose, Jonson showed that he was as adept at handling dramatic speeches as he was when it later came to blank verse in Volpone and the Alchemist. Unlike Shakespeare, Jonson did not feel the need to switch from prose to poetry to signify social status. He endeavours, and most would agree largely succeeds, in conveying these differences through different use of and styling within the prose itself. That can be well argued with this play because we have 2 versions of it, the original in its Italian setting and the later revision set in London. By comparison, scholars have been able to show that as an older editor, Jonson was able to hone his vocabulary to denote character with great precision and complexity. The theory implicit in Every Man in His Humour is that of the new comedy. The themes do not concern the state at large, nor does it publicly attack those in authority. It does, however, reveal the life and the customs and the manners of the people, with its patchwork of characters, through which Jonson hopes to reveal some truths about human nature. His conclusion, although comic, is a little bleak, with vanity and weakness being at the forefront of society in his estimation. With Every Man in His Humour, Jonson takes a huge step forward from The Case is Altered. The uncertainty stamped on nearly every page of that play has almost vanished. Only an occasional clumsiness and infrequent breach of decorum betray the hand of the apprentice playwright. Each character now possesses his own idiom and is revealed by it. Jonson bids his characters speak, and they tell us who and what they are. When he came to revise the play for inclusion in the folio, he found much to add, but in essence little to change. And as I conclude here, I realise that I've not said too much yet about the humours of characters in the play, so I'll pick up on that when we get to Jonson's next play, which in this respect continues in very much the same theme. Every Man Out of His Humour is not strictly a sequel to Every Man in His Humour, but they are very close siblings. But before that, and next time, there is a guest episode where we return to Shakespeare with something of a roundup of his early plays and a look at his worldview. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky, just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.